Great. Thanks, Sean. And Glenn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Janet. It's been great corresponding with you as well in preparation for this. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, it's been good corresponding with you too. So I just wanted to give people an idea of who you are. There's it's very broad spectrum of your involvement in things. So you received your Doctor of Theology and Ministry from Durham University, and you are an senior pastor at New Life Church in Colorado Springs, and you're the lead pastor of one of its eight congregations called New Life Downtown. You are a senior fellow at Barna Group and a visiting fellow at St. John's College at Durham University and an adjunct professor at Denver Seminary. You're also the author of several books. I'm just going to name a few of them. The Resilient Pastor, which I believe is coming out tomorrow, is it being released? Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, yeah. Blessed, Broken, Given, and Worship and the World to Come. There's a few other books that I saw on your website as well, but those are the three that I've named right now. You're also an ordained priest with the Anglican Church of North America. And you speak regularly at conferences and have appeared on numerous podcasts and radio shows. You're also one of the founding leaders and songwriters for a band called Desperation Band, and you've released 3 solo projects with Integrity Music. As a songwriter, you have written and co-written over 65 worship songs. You and your wife and your 4 children live in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. And if people want to find out more about you, they can look at your website, which is glennpackiam.com. Okay. All right. So,
Thank you, Janet. Very kind.
what we thought we'd start off with because many people here will have not read your thesis, some will, but not everyone has. I wondered if you could take some time to explain an overview of your work and kind of give us the heart of what your thesis was about.
I certainly can. Give me a little sense here, Janet, for how long you want me to take, because I certainly we'll adjust how much detail to give or not give based on that.
Right. Well, should we give about 25 minutes for that, Sean?
For that first question.
So 25 minutes
for
the couple of questions that had passed out. So maybe
okay.
5 minutes a question or so.
Okay, sorry.
Great. No, that's wonderful. Okay, that's helpful. So my background is as a worship leader and songwriter, and at some point during those years, I think there was some discomfort that I began to feel with the state of modern worship, and there were definitely some critiques that were arising from that about saying, okay, modern worship is theologically thin and all of this stuff. And I wrestled with that. I've always tried to write songs that were based on scriptures and things like that, but very aware of the sort of power of music and the influence that modern worship has in the church world. And so trying to steward that power well. But I was curious how valid these critiques were or were not. So when I began doing academic work and decided to pursue the doctorate at Durham, the model of practical theology there, which I think is a lot like what you all are very used to, is this mix of sociological analysis or situational analysis employing tools of the social sciences with theological reflection. And in many American evangelical seminary contexts, you sort of have practical theology means you go find out from historical theology or systematic theology where, what we're supposed to do, and then go and apply it. So it sort of becomes a shorthand for applied theology. But the model at Durham was, how do you put theory and praxis into conversation with each other? So what was great about this is I got to sort of interrogate some of these key questions I've had about the modern worship movement. But I had to zero it down. So I narrowed in on a theology of hope and decided to shape my research around how is hope encoded and experienced in contemporary worship songs and services. And so the research is structured in 2 ways. And I know the next question we'll talk a bit more about that, so I won't get into too much of this. But the reason I chose songs and services is using the lens of ritual studies. Ritual studies helps us understand that the text of a ritual is not the same thing as the performance of a ritual. And many of the critiques about Christian worship, contemporary worship, was by pulling apart some song lyrics and saying, look at these lines, look at these words, and not recognizing and not appreciating that, again, in a ritual, it's not just the text, it's also the performance of it. Something happens that is more beyond the text. And there's all kinds of, Roy Rappaport's work on indexical messages and canonical messages. There's different literature that I interacted with to kind of shape the methodology. But the long and the short of it is I had access to a massive group of worship leaders with integrity music. It was a list of about 25,000 worship leaders. I got 1,000 responses back. And there was a number of questions on the survey, things that it sort of poked at or tried to get at their own theology of hope. I would give them 2 statements, an A, B statement, and to say which one represents your view, which one gives you more hope. And then I would also ask some open-ended questions. And this is a technique that is known as free recall. I think Dan Gilbert is the one who's written about this, about what the value of using free recall, so that people can just say not what is most typical, but actually what is most memorable. And the questions that I asked for free recall questions on the survey was, name a song that brought you hope in a time of despair, and then name a song that brought your church hope in a time of despair. And then I cross-referenced both of those lists, sort of compiled them into one list, and it came up with 9 songs that, or actually it was more than that. And then I split out the list of Presbyterian churches, responses from Presbyterian worship leaders and responses from charismatic worship leaders. And the reason I did that is because I knew I was going to do field work with 2 churches, one Presbyterian and one charismatic. So altogether, aggregated those 2 lists and the splitting it out from the general songs that showed up on the general kind of worship leader responses, and then songs that showed up from Pentecostals and Presbyterians. Came up with 9 songs, analyzed the imagery, the lyrics, particularly the verbs and pronouns of the verb tenses, past, present, or future. If it's going to be hope, you would imagine there's some sort of future tense to it. And then my summary of what I found in that is that the songs that were said to be songs of hope were disproportionately focused on the present tense, the personal case, so I, me, and my, and the proximate space, the here and now. And there's a bit of data that kind of goes into that. And then I went and did fieldwork stuff with these 2 churches, participant observation, focus group interviews, semi-structured interviews with pastors and worship leaders at those 2 churches, and recognize that even though the hope in those songs were not what we might like them to be, they don't compare, they don't rise to the level of Christian eschatology in a full sense. Yet it was still a theological hope. It was Godward. It was oriented toward God in a very clear way. And people experienced this hope pretty consistently. They experienced it through a variety of means. In one church, they would talk about this uplift that happened from the time of fellowship after the church, or the quiet moments of prayer. Another church, they talked about the uplift, sort of coming because of the music and the energy and the number of people in the room. So it was consistent, it was variance in a few different ways, and it was resilient. And what I mean by that is it's an adaptive sort of experience of hope. It was the kind of thing where in my focus groups, people would say, yeah, this is how I felt on Sundays, but then on Monday, faced with that diagnosis, faced with that challenge one more time, I definitely felt the dip. But then by attending to that event again, this is, I think, Dan Gilbert's work about re-attending to an event. But for Christians, what it was playing a worship song again, or praying again, or opening their Bible again. And that would sort of provoke that hope to rise again. So the conclusion then was there's a bit of this disparity where the hope was kind of weaker in the text. The experience of it was still pretty strong in the performance of that ritual. And so then theologically reflecting on that, I kind of moved towards a theology of the Spirit, a theology of the Spirit as God's, there's a lot I could say about that. I don't know if I should fully keep going, but a theology of the Spirit as God's sort of eschatological presence, where we're foretasting the future anytime the Spirit is present with us. And then the Spirit as God's sacramental presence, where he communicates to us through our chemistry and brains and even the aesthetics of music and of a room. And the Spirit is God's powerful and empowering presence, where people don't have to be singing about hope, but just reminded of God's power, and that has this effect. And there's reasons for that, even with some of the secular or psychological models of what hope is and is not. So anyway, that's too long of an answer already, but there's a bit of the discussion.
Well, that's great though. Thank you. There were things that you went into, I'm sure, that you were expected to find, but was there anything that you found that you were kind of surprised you didn't expect to find it?
Yeah, I did expect to find that the songs would not say what we would want them to say. They weren't really about new creation or resurrection. But what I did not expect to find was how adaptive hope was for these Christians, particularly in my focus group. Some of the situations I described where, I think of this one story. One person in my focus group said, I was in worship and God said, this legal dispute was going to be settled quickly. It ended up taking months and months. And he's recounting this story to me and saying, and at the end, he gets to the end of it, to the resolution. And he says, it happened exactly as God said. and I wanted to say, well, I thought you said God said it was going to happen quickly, so, but in his mind, that was quickly. So there is this remarkable ability of Christians to reframe, reassess, and not lose hope in the process. And I did not expect that.
Great, thank you. So another question I'd like to ask you is about you utilized an ethnography as well as a mixed method qualitative and quantitative approach for gathering and analyzing your research data. Can you reflect on your research design process with us and why you chose ethnography and why you chose this mixed method approach?
Yeah, I think when you're studying the church, you have to treat the church like its own species, or maybe not species, its own culture. So the tools of the anthropologist are really important here. And again, I mean, there's obviously a lot of development within the field of anthropology itself that I'm only very, very, very loosely aware of. But in the early going, the ideal anthropologist was the disinterested, or not disinterested, the neutral outsider who was observing the tribe, in Papua New Guinea or whatever from a distance, and as the field developed, they actually began to realize that the problem with the outsider is you can actually do violence to the culture that you're trying to observe. And not only are you changing it by being in it, but you might be misrepresenting it. I mean, the famous example of this is the British anthropologist who goes to India and starts writing about the religion of Hinduism. And Hindus are like, what's a religion? Like they have no idea what he's talking about, but he's using a Western frame of religion to impose this on what he calls Hinduism, So you have to be careful. So there actually is this other swing to say an anthropologist who is embedded in a community and in a context might do better work. They might have more of an access and trust to insiders. But of course, the pitfall there is that you'll have rose-colored lenses and you'll see it too closely. So I chose ethnography because I know this world really well. And I have a lot of trust. These churches that said yes to me, particularly the one sort of charismatic megachurch, I've been there to lead worship and to speak at conferences that they've had. So they gave me all kinds of friendship sort of access into the back rooms of pre-service stuff and all of that. And I did feel a compunction to not abuse that and not kind of, do harm, but to try to take seriously their explanations for their events. So the power of ethnography is it allows people to narrate the meaning of their actions in words. It allows people to narrate the meaning of their actions in their own words. If you don't use ethnography, you are narrating the meaning in your words, and you'd be right or you might be wrong. And so I think ethnography is a really powerful tool for studying the church, treating the church as its own sort of culture and context. The mixed methods, I think similarly, I wanted some things that were measurable. So the survey instrument was helpful. One thing I didn't say in the research design, I actually spent a lot of time developing different models of hope. What's a cognitive model of hope, an affective or emotional model of hope, and then a theological model of hope. There's also a phenomenological one in there as well, hope as an act. And then trying to put that all in conversation with synthesizing those models into one kind of working model. Well, when in doing that, I arrived at 7 facets of hope. well, now we got to be able to measure that with some sort of quantitative means. And so that's why my survey instrument that I used with the focus groups and with the worship leaders, the 1,000 worship leaders that responded, the survey instrument had to have questions that dealt with at least a few of those facets. The most notable one, I mean, the most interesting facets of hope to me are space and time. Where is this happening and when is this happening? So from a Christian theological perspective, is this up in the sky, one day we'll fly away, or is this new heaven and new earth, here at Christ's return? So I structured questions that would try to get at that, and allowed me to actually even plot their answers on a grid to say, here's a 2x2 chart of space, here or there, time, now or later, and then to map where these songs were and where these worship leaders were. And I think that's helpful. I think if it had only been qualitative, it would be hard to pin it down. And I think of, recently read the book or listened to the audiobook of Grit by Angela Duckworth. I mean, she develops this sort of grit scale, passion plus perseverance, in order to take something that is a fuzzy, abstract concept and to say, how can we kind of nail this down to the point that we can measure it with instruments like surveys? So I think you need both and I was greatly helped by my supervisors in developing that.
Well, thank you. I mean, certainly there's a lot of detail you went into there, putting it all together and creating all these different aspects of it. So for the next question, I just want to shift gears a little bit. And you've said elsewhere that good theological reflection with poor situational analysis is still bad pastoral theology. Could you expand on that thought for us?
Yeah, I think the elsewhere where I said it was Twitter, and Twitter is a poor place to find good public theology or good pastoral theology, but that doesn't stop us from trying, does it? I think what's tricky about this is, as theologians, it's very easy to resource from the theological tradition and to say, aha, this is, take the metaphor of exile, for example. This is the church in exile, or this is, whatever. And we can find the biblical imagery and even the theologians to bolster that view. But if we have not named our situation correctly and with the complexity that it has, then we haven't done good pastoral theology. It doesn't actually work. It's like a doctor applying a good treatment to the wrong sickness or a good medicine to the wrong sickness. So the theology is solid, but that's the wrong diagnosis, and you got to have both. And of course, conversely, if all you have is a diagnosis, but you don't have the resources of the theological tradition to address that situation, then we're not very helpful either, I will say, though, that in today's climate, I would take that mistake for the other one, for the former, because I would rather people say, hey, this situation about racial injustice there's a lot of complex layers connected to. So think of a pastor trying to address that. I would rather a pastor sort of, name the complexity of it rather than resource from the theological tradition all the reasons why they shouldn't march or they shouldn't do this or this. It's like, well, hang on, you're misapplying something here. And that's a bad example, of course, because actually you resource very easily from the biblical tradition about why we should be advocates of racial justice. I'm thinking of conservative political context where they're sort of like, whoa, hang on, the anti-wokeness sort of meter is high, but not willing to actually name the complexity of the moment. Or on the other side with the pandemic, we've had people kind of say, I saw someone say a governor who doesn't want school children wearing masks is tantamount to Herod slaughtering the innocents, and I thought, well, that's what a powerful, again, a powerful biblical image, but is that quite the same situation? So if we do sloppy work here, we're not going to be doing service to the church or to the public.
Great, thank you. You, as we mentioned earlier, you have this book coming out tomorrow that includes research done in relationship with Barna on pastoral resilience. In what ways did your doctoral work prepare you for this kind of continued research, and how are you balancing your vocation as a practitioner with a vocation as a researcher?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And I really, it's kind of you guys to put that question in there. Yeah, The Resilient Pastor was a book that developed when the president of Barna, which you might be familiar with Barna, they don't do academic research. It's closer to what we might describe as sort of market research, where it's survey instruments and that sort of thing. But he approached me and said, hey, would you partner with us to write something about the challenges pastors are facing in the changing world? Now, this was in February of 2020. So naively, I said, yeah, sounds great. And I said yes, precisely because I thought, the training at Durham and the training as a practical theologian would come in useful, again, pairing situational analysis with theological reflection. Had no idea that a pandemic would break out a few weeks later, but was so grateful that this was a moment now to kind of speak to this. So I did, because it was more of a popular level research, I did the thing that you're not supposed to do as an academic. I made my outline of the challenges and then shaped the research around that outline. But in a way, it's sort of like creating a hypothesis. So I had a hypothesis that these 8 things were challenges, 4 for the pastor and 4 for the church. And then we structured our research questions, our survey questions around those 8 challenges, and I incorporated some existing data, then the new data. And then I had focus groups. That was one of the tools that I learned at Durham, was like, oh, we're doing practical theology. Is okay, we can't just have survey instruments and stats. We need to have mixed methods. I like mixed methods. So I did 3 focus groups with pastors in Canada, the US, and the UK. And it was super helpful in kind of hearing them talk about these 8 challenges and where they line up with the story the stats are telling, on where they don't. But the goal was to let the insights be the minor player and not the major player. So the data is about 20-25% of each chapter. But really what I'm trying to do is mine church history and mine the scriptures for wisdom. So to say it like this, to pair insight with wisdom and to let that sort of be the help for pastors. So I think in a very real way, I got to kind of use some of those muscles that were developed in this training. And in the question, I do think of my vocation as a practitioner or as a pastor. That's my primary vocation. And I do think of researcher as a secondary vocation that really is done in the margins. And that really the only reason I had time to do this kind of research work while being a pastor was because in the fall of 2020, I had vocal cord bleeding and I ended up having surgery, and I was out of the pulpit for 3 months. And so I could talk very minimally, but I was reading and writing like crazy in those 3 months. Every day I just go to the basement and read and write. So if another opportunity like this arose for this sort of a scale of project, I'm not sure how I would say yes to that. But yeah, so my advice to others, in various vocations, there are small ways, there's small sort of everyday ways of realizing, hang on, how do we pair theory and practice? How do I get a snapshot of my situation while also thinking deeply? And in a sense, if you end up being in church ministry or preaching, teaching, every sermon is a little bit like that, but really a lot of our decisions are kind of like that.
Great. Well, thank you for answering our questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean for opening up for other people to ask questions to you. All right, Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Janet. If you would like to ask a question, I'll ask that you use the hand raising feature within Zoom, because it allows us to create a queue to be able to see. And I'll start us off with just an initial question, so that everyone has a bit of time to think of anything that they want to say about anything that Glenn has said or left unsaid. And so, Glenn, I'm interested to know how your doctoral work sort of has shaped or informed your pastoral work at the church.
Well, our worship teams here, one of my roles, so I lead our downtown congregation, but I also have the joy of very loosely overseeing the community of worship leaders that serve at all of the New Life congregations in Colorado Springs. So from time to time, there are these special events or retreats or things like that. And they, being aware of my work, have said, so what do we need to do differently? Or how do we, So it has, in a wonderful way, not a critical way, but in a really wonderful way, inspired the team to write songs about the new creation, to write songs about the return of Christ, to write songs about the resurrection, and to write songs that are more robust in its vision of Christian hope. So that's one sort of really, really easy kind of tie-in. The second thing is, I think very often about one of the models of hope that I learned about in doing this work, which is the intersection of agency and pathway. Charles Snyder describes hope that way. And that has shown up for me in my preaching, but that's also showed up for me in my leadership. So in a very small way, if you lead in a way that takes agency out of the person that you're leading, that workplace, that work environment has now become a place of despair and desolation, and they're not going to last on your staff or on your team very long. So even just something small like that, of realizing, man, if you can return agency to people, give them a voice in the process, is another way we say it. That's deeply dignifying as a pastor or leader to do. So those are a couple quick examples.
Great, thank you. Stefan.
So, Glenn, thank you very much for being with us. I read your dissertation, and I'm very interested in all that you're doing. I'm the research project that I'm in the early stages of. I intend to do focus groups in a variety of churches, so I'm definitely interested in that. Sort of a two-part question here. In terms of just recruiting people to come to your focus groups, and then all the way on the other end of the spectrum, the analysis of your focus group interviews after it was all done. Is there anything in those two areas that you would do differently if you could do it all over again? So just practical advice there. And then my other question related to this is just the process of actually moderating a focus group. Anything, and this probably would apply to other forms of research, not just focus groups, but what advice would you have for, how to draw people out? If you're really trying to find out what's going on the ground, you're really trying to learn how, in leading a focus group, any practical advice how to draw people out, how so you really hear and get good information in your focus group interview?
Yeah, Stefan, I mean, that's definitely the key, isn't it? I'll start with the first one. I asked the pastors at the churches to help me. I said, here's my goal, is I want to get a representative group of your congregation. You know these people, so can you help me with age, gender, ethnicity, that sort of thing? And they mostly, I mean, the one church, it really was a good cross section. The other church, I felt like it really skewed one way by age. It was the Presbyterian church, and it was an older group. And I was in their service. I knew there were some younger families, but I didn't have that in my focus group. So I think if I had more time or were to do it again, I would work harder at getting that group to be a bit more representative. There's obviously, the usual sort of ethics board stuff that every university has, and you get people to sign waivers and allow you to record and that kind of thing. The thing about getting them to talk is you have to find creative ways to get at the thing that you want them to talk about. And especially with church people, because we're so conditioned to give Jesus answers or Christian answers, So even I couldn't ask, for example, do you ever experience hope at church? I mean, of course they're saying yes all the time, But I had to say something like, have you ever come into church feeling one way and then left feeling another way? So I didn't even say feeling better, and then get them talking. The other thing is there's always the pressure for group conformity, for people to kind of say the same thing. And anytime one person takes a risk to break with the narrative, you got to really encourage that and make them feel safe. I remember one of my focus groups, everybody was talking about the music and the energy and how they loved it. And this one gal goes, yeah, well, not my first time at this church. I hated that. I thought it was too loud. I didn't like the songs. And, nervous laughter. And I was like, yeah, no, that's totally, tell me more, So you have to encourage the dissenter. Otherwise, you're going to get sort of groupthink here, which is, man, again, the other trap of focus groups. And then maybe related to that, I used my survey instrument also with the focus groups so that they could answer some of these questions privately. And that's a helpful thing.
Thanks so much. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Dale.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for being here, by the way. I'm doing research on Pentecostal triumphalism and trauma, how they deal with trauma. And so your idea of hope really kind of sprang true. I'm just wondering if there's a difference between the charismatics and the others, and even if there's a difference between the evangelicals and non-evangelicals when they have a sense of hope, whether it's immediate or is it future?
There's definitely a difference, Dale, and your work sounds so important and so fascinating. There's definitely a difference. And in the book, Worship in the World to Come, which is sort of a slightly thinned out version of the dissertation, I talk about how, or you'll see the charts where charismatics tend to be more focused on the future and more focused on the present and more focused on the up there kind of stuff, so there, you might say there's a tendency to be escapist with it and to be sort of locked in the moment about it and to lose kind of a narrative frame, which the theological way of saying that is an over-realized eschatology where everything is kind of here and now. And that tendency affects the way they sing about hope, talk about hope, and it affects the way they talk about the future. If sort of Jesus has given me the victory now, then the only thing I need to look forward to is getting out of this place, and that's very much embedded in the trick, the disheartening thing from the charismatic church that I did in my field work with was they actually had a long sermon series on the end times, and it was all about the rapture, and it was all, so perfect for my study, but very discouraging in terms of, boy, this is not at all the new creation sort of vision of eschatology. So I suspect, Dale, your instincts or your hunch, you're going to find some really interesting things there. There is a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Porter.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks so much for being here. Great listening to you and to see your work. I'm deeply involved in, some of this kind of same world, so I find it very fascinating and intriguing. But I have really just a kind of a technical question, partly because I think it's relevant for some other people in this group as well. And that is, what kind of theoretical, maybe you say about this, but humor me and say more.
No.
How did you weight the words that you used in responses to determine, which ones counted more or less?
In the lyrics?
Yeah, or and in people's responses maybe too, right? You probably coded responses in some ways, right? Or maybe you didn't, I don't know, but
I didn't get that far, yeah.
Okay. So then lyrics, how did you weight them? Like, why would one word count more than another, or a form of a word count more?
Dr. Porter, those are great questions.
You can just call me Wendy.
There's great questions, and I wish there's many things that I think I could have made the methodology more rigorous on that front. Once I identified 7 facets of hope, that became my theoretical framework for evaluating hope in the songs. And the ones that I really zeroed in on, two of the 7 was the space and time stuff. So verbs became really easy for me to look at in the songs, to talk about verb tenses. And I did verb tenses for God's action and verb tenses for our action. So when are we saying we're going to do stuff? What are we, but then I had to come back around and say, okay, so verb tenses skew in the present. Is that automatically bad or whatever, and to give some alternate explanations of it. And I gave 3 possible explanations for example, the verb thing. So in a way, this was like relativizing the weight of each verb. The one explanation was, well, look, if you're singing about God, you're going to sing about God in the present tense. Holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. I mean, what are you going to do with that? This isn't
not holy was the Lord.
Right. That's right. This is his essence, not his action. But then I said, but there's another possible explanation here, and that is that the present tense is very comfortable for the songwriter. And I named kind of the city that each of these songs were where the songwriters for each of those songs lived. And then I compared them to James Cone's work on the spirituals and the blues, and to say that the slave spirituals were overwhelmingly about the future because the present was not good. Yeah. And so I kind of raised the question that someone else has to fully, you know, sort of investigate, but I raised the question if singing about the present tense is a luxury of the privileged, you know. So now I'm kind of putting the weight back on the other side of maybe these verb tenses really do matter. So I didn't do it in a technical way or in a very clear kind of way, but yeah.
I wasn't looking to kind of point any fingers. I just was curious. And I know that a number of students are asking these questions, right? How are we going to weigh things and say that this counts or it doesn't count? And so that's really helpful and interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Jason.
Hello, Dr. Packiam. You probably don't recognize me by face, but perhaps by name from our childhood.
Oh my goodness. Portland, Oregon?
That's right. How are you?
It's good to see you, Jason. Wow. How about that?
I'm curious about the different contexts that you find these same words in. And you know, to say the same thing in a different context is to say something different, you know?
Yeah.
And you seem experienced, having some experience in the Anglican Church, the Pentecostal world, so on and so forth. And you did studies in Presbyterian versus Charismatic. How much does the context, whether a high liturgy or a low church Pentecostal, how much does that really affect the meaning of the songs we're singing and the effect that in your study?
Big time. And I think in the field work, and Jason, hi, great to see you after all these years in Portland. Would love to catch up at some point. You know, what's interesting is, from the survey of worship leaders, there were one or two songs that crossed into all three settings, that were named by all three kind of settings. But from my field work, I didn't notice any songs that crossed over. It wasn't like that same song was being sung in both contexts. So the context actually shaped song choice, and shaped, even though they're both sort of modern worship songs, they were pulling from different pages of the hymn book, as it were, you know. So there's that. And I think that greatly affected kind of, I couldn't control the group to say, you guys are not both singing, you know, Great Are You, Lord, or Good Father, or whatever it was, you know. They were singing, they were pulling from different songs. And the Presbyterians were pulling more often from hymns, peppered in with contemporary worship songs. And their response was sort of conditioned by confessing the creed as part of their worship. So they were more likely to give me the right answer about the future than the charismatic church was, because the liturgy had sort of formed them a little bit. I'm not really getting at the question you asked, but I don't have a proper answer for the actual question you asked, because it wasn't the same song sung in both contexts, I guess.
Thank you.
Hey, Carson.
Yeah. Hi, Glenn. Thank you for your sharing, and also very inspired by your paper. I learned a lot because I am working on a research paper about congregational singing. So you can imagine, awesome. and how that shapes our social identity, if any.
Wow.
Okay. So one thing that maybe it's similar to what Wendy asked earlier is because I'm experiencing this challenge of categorizing the songs. So I'm sorting the song albums, analyzing the lyrics. You know, sometimes when you say this song, maybe in your case this is relating to the theology of hope, but it can also be other theologies within one song, or maybe it can be attributed to multiple categories. So how do you deal with those data? So that here's my base for analysis.
Yes. Carson, thank you for that. And I'm sure you're interacting with Monique Ingles' work. Monique she's down at Baylor. I mean, her work on congregational singing and identity is really, really important stuff. So in fact, I think Monique has a book called Singing the Congregation that is really, really excellent. If you haven't checked that out, please do. What you're describing is exactly the reason I chose the approach of having people name a song that brings them hope, rather than analyzing top songs from CCLI. So if I had done top songs for CCLI, first of all, even though in my previous life, I've benefited from songs being ranked on CCLI, and it's a wonderful thing. But I also know there are commercial and market forces that complicate how and why those songs rise to the top. So that's not, again, not necessarily representative in the way that we might want it to be, right? But secondly, I would be starting with a song and then trying to parse out the theme, and that's like you said, very, very tricky. So I went around it by having people say, what's a song that you sing that at church that brings you hope? And I'm asking worship leaders that. So it's like saying to a worship leader, you need to sing a song of hope on Sunday. What's your go-to? And they're naming it for me, so, and then I'm looking at the song and saying, well, actually, this song says a lot more about comfort or a lot more about, victory than it does hope. So I kind of got at it a different way. And I don't know with your sort of work on social identity, I don't know how you would try to structure that, except to say, and again, here, maybe this is part of Monique's work, is she talks a lot about songs that appear in certain conferences. So like she talks about going to a Passion conference or songs that appear from a certain entity like Hillsong, and that does singing them give you a sense of association or affiliation with those identities that then kind of contribute to your own construction of identity. I mean, it's a very complicated thing, but I think you get at it by, maybe how you get at it is by making these sort of connect the dots. Where else does this song show up the most, or frequency, or whatever, but you have to find another metric than purely just what's the theme of the song, because worship songs often have many different themes that they could be categorized by.
It is. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jesse.
Yeah, hi. Thank you from me as well, Dr. Packiam. It's so great to hear from you.
Fine, yeah.
And I'm doing research very, very early on in kind of the realm of liturgical theology. And I was interested in your dissertation. You write about liturgical theology is difficult to kind of transpose into the study of Pentecostal worship because it's oriented around sacraments, and those are foreign categories.
Yes.
And then later on in your dissertation, you say something really interesting. You say that in worship, Christians reenact the transfer of agency in their lives upward to God, which I think is just like a great statement. And I was wondering if, like, out of your practical research, that might become a place where there could be some conversation with liturgical theology. And like, it seemed almost like something that like Aidan Kavanaugh could have said or something, right? And so I was wondering, and then in your own ministry work, you're kind of at that intersection as well, being ordained in the ACNA, and then also living in this contemporary worship world. Where do you see that conversation going, academically or pastorally?
That's very good. I mean, I appreciate that very, very thoughtful and close reading of my dissertation stuff. My objection to using sacramental language or Eucharistic language to describe what's happening in Pentecostal or charismatic worship is not because there's no crossover, but simply because those terms would be foreign, are not germane to that group, And I think we, again, using that sort of anthropology lens of let people make meaning of their own actions in their own words, charismatics and Pentecostals would use the language of encounter. They would use the language of sort of John's gospel type stuff, one-on-one personal relationship with Jesus, that kind of thing. But I have found to kind of flip the script, to use language of encounter in the charismatic sense to help charismatic evangelicals embrace liturgical practices. So at our church, just to give you a peek at it, New Life Downtown, well, all of our New Life congregations do weekly communion, but New Life Downtown, we actually do quite a few pronounced movements around the table where there's a clear movement of confession, of assurance, of the memorial acclamation. I mean, all the movements that I learned from Book of Common Prayer, right one or right two or whatever. So, but in order to explain that to people, I would say the table is a place of encounter. The table is a place where we meet with Jesus. People, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I want to be part of that, And then not just language, but actually even the aesthetics. So what's a sort of basic worship aesthetics in charismatic world? Well, play the keyboard, please, right? So when we say the liturgy, there's keyboard playing, there's a piano pad there or whatever. And the reason for that is to help people understand the same posture that you come to a song with, come to the table with, come with that same sort of thing. So there's I think there's actually lots of overlap theologically between those two worlds. I actually think the sacramental theology, and this, I wrote Blessed, Broken, Given as sort of a for every person kind of non-academic attempt at an explainer of sacramental theology. And I think that notion that God is at work in his world is very much like charismatic theology at its best. Now, Dale, we were talking about the kind of charismatic theology that is escapist, but there is a healthy version of charismatic theology that says the Holy Spirit is here. And so I think the bridge between the sacramental or liturgical and the Pentecostal, the bridge is pneumatological. The bridge is a theology of the Spirit. And if we can, that's actually language that will cross over really well. So rather than say, oh, these charismatics, the song is Eucharistic, or the song is the sacrament. Like, we don't understand that, and maybe if you say it to the liturgical person, anyway, the point is use language of the Spirit. And I think that gets us closer to building that bridge.
So I'm going to invite a quick comment from Wendy, and then Dr. Beach will have the last question. So Wendy, you can comment, and then we'll go to Lee.
Glenn, just a real quick thing that I think is one of our students, a student that's working with me, is developing a whole approach to understanding Pentecostal worship as actually having sacrament as part of it, especially in terms of the Eucharist. So I'm just saying, maybe in the future, there'll be more people who will converse on that and provide a wider range of this. So that's all.
Love that, Wendy.
Yeah.
A couple of resources. Chris Green's book, he's written something called The Pentecostal Theology of the Lord's Supper. Chris Green is a Pentecostal theologian. And then in Sui Hong Lim Sui Hong and Lester Ruth's book, even their small one, Brief History of Christian Worship, they talk about specific elements of the Eucharist that are all there in contemporary praise and worship. And again, it's interesting that those crossovers are there. So we can each of us can use our language to explain the other,
For sure.
Yeah, it's good.
Glenn, thanks so much for this. We really appreciate this. And this is a thing we do for our practical theology colloquium. And so I actually want to pick up on a couple of things. And frankly, these are not going to be well-formed questions, but I want you to kind of, a couple of things you picked up, you said that I'd love to hear you say just a little bit more about. So one was the idea that, and I think sometimes, and I've been guilty of this myself, full disclosure, the idea of doing sloppy work. And I'd like you to maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of when you're doing good research in practical theology, the way, because as a practical as a pastor, theologian, whatever I am, I've probably done a bit of sloppy work in my life. And so I would like you to say a word about that. The other thing is the use of mixed methods, because that's a big thing in our DPT program. We're all for mixed methods. And so I'm giving you a couple things there, throwing them out. And those are two kind of different topics, but I if you don't mind, could you just expand on those for me?
Well, I'm the chief of sinners in sloppy work. So I'm speaking to myself as an admonition to not move too quick. And honestly, the reason I slip into it is usually because of speed. I'm moving too fast and I'm trying to get to a conclusion or wrap up a sermon or comment on this or that. And sometimes it's the best you can do. And it's if we're moving quickly and it is the best that we can do, then we should at least tone down the force that we say it with, and to say, hey, one possible, I'm learning to soften my soften the strength of the opinion that is being offered. And then in other cases to say, this really demands a more nuanced look, and I need to take time to hear other perspectives, and until I've, what's the phrase we use in practical theology, until you've complexified an issue, you haven't really named it yet. So yeah, that's that. And what was the second thing you mentioned, Lee? Was
the issue mixed methods, idea of using mixed methods. Yeah.
And you're for that. You guys like that here. Yeah. I like it too. I mean, in a way, it's just different data points. It's a way of getting at. It's preventing you from having too easy of a conclusion. The trick with that is, again, if you're doing this in the academic world, it's great. If you're doing that in pastoral work or in other areas of life, it can be difficult, because then people are like, well, what's the conclusion? Like, tell us the conclusion. And mixed methods might at least lend some confidence to be able to say, well, we've got it. What's the one thing that seems to be in agreement here with all of these data points, from people to statistics to, whatever. So I really encourage it. It is harder. I will say that when you're trying to use mixed methods, it means you're probably not going deep enough in any of them, just because of the limitations of scale and scope. And you just sort of have to accept that, right?
Yeah, that's so good. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. Is that okay?
I hope so. I'm the junior here in the group, in the academy,
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I think that's sort of why we're a bit nervous about it. Mm-hmm. is because we feel like maybe I'm not, but yeah, we're not against mixed methods. In fact, I kind of think mixed methods is a good thing, but yeah, the problem is you always feel like maybe I'm not actually plumbing down deep enough on one method to do it. But I think that's practical theology. And,
it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So are you all connected to McMaster?
Yeah. So first off, yeah. So thank you, Glenn. Yeah. This is so it's a guild of current students in all the different programs that the college offers, as well as faculty and some alumni. Awesome. And so we're all sort of connected and interested in practical theology and learning from scholars around the world. And so
that's awesome. And you're in Toronto, is that right?
In Hamilton, so about an hour west of Toronto. Yeah.
I have an aunt and uncle who live in Hamilton. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to come visit us sometime.
I know, I haven't seen him in years, but I need to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we're over time, and so I just want to say thank you again. And for the guild, just a reminder, our next meeting is on March 14th. We are going to be speaking with Dr. Helen Collins, who will be talking about rethinking theological reflection and talking about reflection paradigms that are used in practical theology and challenging us to start with scripture in those paradigms. And so that's on March 14th at the same time, 1 p.m. If you want to sign up for the email list to get those reminders, you can contact Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, if you could put your email in the chat, that would be fantastic. But thank you, Glenn, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you all.
Glenn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Bless you.
That was
Thank you,
great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.